down in Soho Square, dropping H's everywhere, speaking English any way they like. You, sir, did you go to school?
What do you type me for, a fool?
No one taught him take instead of type. Hear a Yorkshireman, or worse, hear a Cornishman converse. I'd rather hear a choir singing flat. Chickens cackling in a barn, just like this one.
Gom.
Gom. I ask you, sir, what sort of word is that? It's ow and gom that keep her in her place, not her wretched clothes and dirty face. Why can't the English teach their children how to speak? This verbal class distinction by now...
That's not exactly the theme of today's show, but it was close enough, and I wanted to play it. I wanted to play it anyway. Today on the show, we are going to be talking to our friend Ben Yagoda. His new book is Gobsmacked, The British Invasion of American English. This is a little bit more, that song is a little bit more about the British doing something that they do, which is to worry internally about what's happening to their speech. Although, Ben, I think if this song were to be rewritten for today, the phrase "in it" would have to come up, because I know a lot of British people are very worried about the fact that the youth, particularly the youth of a certain stratum, punctuate just about everything they say with "in it."
Although they wouldn't say youth, they would say youth.
Youth, yeah.
Like Keith Richards, that's called TH Brunting, which is a characteristic of that argot. Yeah, but the youth in it.
So I've been excited about this book since you started mentioning it on Facebook, and I don't think this has ever happened to me before. The minute I understood what this book was about, I had a very specific example of something that I hoped that it would treat of, and it turns out it's the first thing you bring up in the book, which made me just insanely happy, and that is the phrase "gone missing," which, I don't know that I would have known to stick a pin right in the Chandra Levy story, but it was clear to me as a person of a certain age. I mean, when you're a certain age, you notice that something is being said that didn't used to be said, and that's kind of how we become aware of these things. So right away, I thought people didn't used to say "gone missing," but now they do. But take it away from it's a great example of what you're writing about at a whole bunch of different levels. But I want to hear what you say.
Well, I guess we're kindred spirits, because that really was, I think, the thing that got me started on this whole enterprise like 15 years ago or something like that. I'd spent time in London teaching study abroad courses at the University of Delaware, where I taught. And one of the courses was on the British press, which is an institution, in itself. And reading a lot of newspapers, magazines, I would notice all these different words and terms and phrases that were way, way more than what you would get from watching Dick Van Dyke in Mary Poppins, or the typical stage Englishman who says, cheerio and bumbershoot, which of course is its story in itself that maybe we can get to. But there were just hundreds and hundreds of these phrases. This was like probably the mid-90s or so. And then some years later, over the next 5-10 years, I started noticing Americans using these, what I had thought of as British terms, and the "go missing" one might have been the one that got me started. Certainly the one that sticks in my mind, because it was. And when I tell young people that, they look at me like I'm a nut. They think "go missing" was always used in the U.S., but as you and I know, it wasn't. And instead, it would be things like a person disappeared or vanished. That was the accepted term, which sounds a little bit like a magician's act. So the "go missing," which actually isn't even that old in the UK. I think it's about 50, 60, 70 years old. They didn't say that before then. Started to be used. And nowadays, there's all sorts of tools you can use to search for words and phrases historically, whether it's the New York Times archive or Google Books or Google Ngram Viewer and other resources as well. And I kind of pinpointed it to this big news story in 2001 of a congressional intern, Chandra Levy, who had disappeared, vanished, and then writers started to say that she went missing. And it seems like it picked up from there. And a lot of these words and phrases are successful in a kind of Darwinian reason because they're useful. They serve a purpose that wasn't being served before. So arguably, go missing is better than vanished and disappeared. But in any case, it's here now for sure.
Absolutely. And I thought, I mean, you're such a good detective, Ben, that you found, I think, probably the American reporter who first used it in relation to the Levy case. And it turned out she did have kind of a British connection or a Scottish connection or something. There was like a reason that she might have been doing that.
Yeah, she wrote me, and I think her name is Helen Kennedy, and she wrote me that, she had spent a lot of her time as a youth in the UK, and she was kind of gobsmacked to learn that it hadn't been used here, the phrase "go missing" before. That's one of the, so I started a blog called Not One Off Britishisms, One Off being another example in 2011, and just hearing from people, the comments, the emails, it's, people say, don't read the comments. In my case, and in your case as well, Colin, I have to say that you put a thing on Facebook about this interview, and people started giving all these, brilliant, to use another Britishism that I think one of them mentioned, examples. So the community of people who are interested in this kind of issues in language and is a community that I've enjoyed for sure.
Yeah, this book is so much fun too. I mean, I could probably have a conversation with you about every page of this book. There's like everything in it is interesting to a certain kind of person, and I'm one of those persons. But I mean, it also resolves.
I'm here. I have nothing to do.
But it also resolves all kinds of things. I mean, there's actually a debate in my family. Beth Curry will be very happy to read the pages in your book about the word often, because she's very upset about people who say often, and I think I might even be one of those people. So, and that brings up, let's just mention that whole section of the book, which is really fascinating. The Britishisms which are in use are fascinating, but there's a whole segment of the book about kind of faux Britishisms, attempts to sound kind of British or something along those lines. And one of the people you single out is a person who I always regard as kind of nearly flawless about things like this and brilliant in all the senses of the word brilliant. Let's hear him though. Maestro, this is A1.
I know I'm not the only one who may be more than a little dismayed about what's happening on the campaign trail right now. The divisive and often vulgar rhetoric that's aimed at everybody, but often is focused on the vulnerable or women or minorities.
That, of course, is the comedian Jackie Mason. No, it's not. Yeah. It's Barack Obama. And he does this divisive thing, which I know drives you nuts.
Well, that's fair. It does rather. Yes. So the word is divisive. The British people have always pronounced it divisive, but divisive popped up. And I think actually what I found was maybe not the first person to use it, but the first person to be called out on it was Obama's predecessor, George H.W. Bush, who said it and was taken to task for it. But it's quite appealing. I mean, the British say things like vitamin and other short I words. So it sounds British, it sounds fancy, it sounds kind of cool. And it hasn't really taken off, but it's out there. I hear it quite a bit. The other one that's similar, that is an actual Britishism in terms of pronunciation, is Americans had always said the word organization, or U.S. people. Canadians and British said organization. So if you hear a hockey player talking about, the organization is bringing along some good defensemen and things like that, that was always a way, if someone didn't have a British accent, to tell, yep, they're Canadian.
So we have stressing the fact that although there's no I in team, there's definitely an I in organization.
Organization. And, it's one of these things, like with often and amongst and whilst, which one of your listeners pointed out, that, and I picked up these things when I was teaching. and reading students' papers. All of those things, and hearing them talk, saying often, or even more so, oftentimes, just adding words and letters and syllables. Those are all British things that have become popular amongst the young. Why? That's a little beyond my pay grade, but it is happening for sure.
I think there are also, in terms of pretentiousness, I think there's room for debate about some of these things. For example, the term bespoke. I know that you think that might have a little slightly pretentious lean to it, but say a little bit more about how you see it.
I'm not sure I feel that way, but so bespoke is a word that came, I think, originally from shoemaking back in the 17 or 1800s. And it developed a meaning into the 20th century in Britain for a custom-made shoe or garment. And there was a movie that I saw in high school based on Gogol's, the Russian writer's short story, The Overcoat, and it was called The Bespoke Overcoat. It was a British film from the 1950s, I think it was. Then it's not so much pretentious as it became a vogue word, and has become a vogue word. So, I mean, if you Google bespoke, you'll come up with bespoke investment options, bespoke dining experiences, bespoke audio design. It's just literally.
I think it can be used
anything.
artfully. Yeah, it can be used artfully that way. I mean, if I were to say to you that J.D. Vance observes a bespoke version of Christianity, you would know what I meant.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
One that was sort of uniquely designed to suit all of his needs. All right. Well, we're going to take a quick break here. This is a very quick break, by the way. No one's going to ask you for money or anything like that. And then we're going to come. Well, maybe somebody will in your house, but then we're going to right back with more of Ben. All right. With us is Ben Yagoda. His book is Gobsmacked, The British Invasion of American English.
I've got to say, these musical numbers are truly brilliant. I bet it's that Jonathan, that U2 guitar wizard guy coming up with these things, easy peasy and gone missing. Who knew?
It's my chagrin, with chagrin, that I tell you I'm the one who picked out all.
Well done, you.
Yes, this is what I do with my mornings. Ben Yagoda, by the way, author, co-author, editor of 14 books, the host of the podcast, The Lives They're Living. So we might as well just talk about this one because it's right there in the song. And I think there's a category of things in this book where, and a lot of it depends on your age, but I would not have thought run up, over the top, a piece of cake were specifically British things that made their way into American parlance. And I'm not sure what I would have thought about easy peasy, but it wouldn't have been automatic for me to think that this started as a British thing, although I know how much they love rhyming things. But so say a little bit about easy peasy.
Yeah, easy peasy is probably the most problematic or vexed one in my detective work. Because for one thing, if you ask any British person or most British people, what's the origin of easy peasy? They would say it's the ad slogan or advert, as they would call it, easy peasy lemon squeezy, which is completely wrong. There is they call it washing up liquid. We call it dish detergent called Squeezy there. But their slogan was never, and they never had a product called Lemon Squeezy, and they never had a slogan, easy peasy lemon squeezy. But it's kind of a Mandela effect, if you're familiar with that, a commonly held misconception that came from who knows where. But you're right about the rhyming, and when you look it up, it shows up the phrase just easy peasy, not with the lemon squeezy. In a number of different places, American, British, and my feeling is it's just kind of came to somebody's mind because it was a rhyme that something rhymed with easy and peasy, sure. And so it came up that way. As a established expression, it really dates to the 90s and 2000s and started in Britain, but it's uh, at least as common here now. So it's just a commonplace. I mean, the other one that you mentioned that struck me was a piece of cake, which actually means the same thing, come to think
Yes,
of
it
it.
does. Easy peasy.
Easy
Yeah.
peasy, piece of cake. And my friend Wes Davis, who's a connoisseur of these things, uh, emailed me something he had read from a memoir of somebody who did a long sailing expedition in the 60s. And there was a line in there and said, well, it was, as the British say, a piece of cake. I was like, what? Heard that all my life. And it turns out it was, which was a big source of slang. The Royal Air Force, RAF, in World War II came up with lots of expressions, including a piece of cake. And in fact, a book in the 40s about RAF slang was titled A Piece of Cake. So, boffins and gone pear-shaped and several others came out of World War II. And a lot came out of World War I as well.
We should say that one of the many brilliant things in this book is that you have kind of a rating system for how far along towards assimilation or beyond assimilation these words have gone. And I think looking at them too, looking at where you rate things, I mean, it is pretty subjective. A lot of it does depend on who you're listening to, where you are. There are things that I feel have been absorbed into the language, into the American parlance, that you don't. But I think it's a great way to do this too. You can sort of look at gone pear-shaped or went pear-shaped and think, okay, so where, are people really saying that a lot? But maybe say a little bit, you actually use some advanced metrics to figure some of this stuff out.
Well, that might be cramming a bit too much. The tool that let me really do the blog and the book is something called Google Ngram Viewer. It's NGRAM Viewer, and people can Google that and get to it. And it's an online tool where Google uses Google Books, which is essentially digitizing virtually every book ever published. And you can do explorations and investigations into that corpus of books, including on Google Ngram Viewer, showing the relative popularity of a word or phrase from year to year, from 1700 to the present. But wait, there's more. You can compare its use in British books versus American books. So you're right, Colin, that measure, which, by the way, in the first draft, it was called penetration, but it was considered that might be make the book R-rated or something, so it changed to adoption. It is somewhat subjective, and when I'm using Ngram Viewer, it's only what's been written. It's not what people say and talk, which is a whole other thing and harder to measure. But when I say, on that 1 to 5 scale, when I say it's outpaced, if you look at a piece of cake, and it's more commonly used here in the U.S. books than in British books by now, then I'll say outpaced. Otherwise, yeah, it's subjective. It's kind of based on the evidence I've seen in my own impression. Like you say, it is sort of a sweet spot for me, the pseudoscientific.
I mean, a lot of it depends on the source of exposure. We all based on often our age and what we were consuming in terms of culture. I mean, for example, I have no problem understanding what the word peckish means to the British because of Monty Python. And I think, as you point out in the book, I think they've used it more than once, but one of them is about an undertaker who has several different options. But the last one is that you eat your beloved deceased person. And John Cleese, when this is brought up, he said, I do feel a little bit peckish. But I mean...
Well, yeah, and I'm glad you brought it up, because the question of where these words and phrases come from, Monty Python is one thing, Harry Potter books, the BBC. Jonathan was saying that he watches YouTube videos about guitars and movies and music criticism, many of which, for some reason, are British people, and picks up language from there. Kids' TV, like Peppa Pig and Thomas the Tank Engine, Harry Potter books, I might have mentioned. British journos, which is their term for journalists that have come over here to the U.S., whether it was Tina Brown or Christopher Hitchens or Andrew Sullivan. There's been in this last 25, 30, 40-year period, a lot of cross-pollination back and forth. And by the way, probably close to half the readers of my blog are from the UK, and they are kind of surprised and charmed by this, because what they've heard all their lives, a la Henry Higgins from My Fair Lady, although I'm not sure he talked about the Americans, but that American English is polluting the English language. What with people saying, "Can I get a coffee?" and "Things are awesome," and "you guys." And just a few weeks ago, there was and often these complaints are filled with misinformation. There was one such one in the Daily Telegraph in the Britain about how horrible it was that people are calling chips fries and calling biscuits cookies. So they've heard that narrative. So this other narrative about it going the other way, they find kind of surprising and amusing.
Well, it's also very confusing because our chips are their crisps. It's really complicated. Yes, I mean, there was a period of time, correct me if I'm wrong, where this is quite a bit earlier, where there were just convulsions about the American pollution from the word okay, or if that's even a word. They were really worried about.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I was not familiar with that. And, there probably was, but that's become just completely absorbed. And you guys is on its way to that level. There's still a little upset and outrage about you guys and awesome.
Let's go back to some of the things that you sort of talk about in the book. And I mean, one of the things that does fascinate me is the way that, and I think with Gone Missing, you say this, but certain words become absorbed because they're almost better or more useful. And one that I know is on your blog that I'm fascinated by is the term sack or sacked. Which I actually think I'm hoping that gets more absorbed, because I think it's for example, in my previous radio job, I was sacked, and I'm not really sure whether I was fired or laid off or let go or anything like that. So, but sacked seems to kind of cover it all.
Okay,
and so
it's interesting. So it reminds me of the magazine Variety had its own and still has its own lingo, and their verb was ankled.
Yes.
So someone ankled a job at Fox. It wasn't clear whether they left on their own accord, quit, fired, whatever. But yeah, sacked, I think of personally as a synonymous with fired, not so much laid off, but it's stronger. It's got that cuss sound in it.
Yeah.
It brings to mind the sack of Rome and terrible things like that. And fired is a little softer sounding, and also there's all sorts of different kinds of fire. So I'm with you on that. I think sacked is maybe it'll have legs, as Variety would say.
Yeah, I think everything's kind of colored by our perceptions. I was very addicted to the podcast version of a British radio show called The Frank Skinner Show. Frank Skinner is this wonderfully literate and fascinating British comedian. But when they canceled it and they left him on the air for like 8 or 9 more episodes, he kept saying, "Well, as you all know, we've been sacked." And he said it was such satisfaction. I thought, it does seem to take the curse off it somehow, which is probably also a British phrase.
And, I should point out that, as I was said at the start about coming into contact with all these British expressions, the substantial majority, of them have not come over here.
Yes.
And talking about firing and sacking, they have a word for laying someone off. I imagine you know what that is.
I don't think I do.
Okay. They were made redundant.
Ah.
And that's a little wordier and probably won't come over here. Laying off is a little more efficient, but it's an example of a British expression that has not come over.
There's so much more that I want to talk about, and we're running out of time, but I think it's important to reinforce the thing that you just said, which is that, yes, there's a tremendous amount of cross-pollination just because everybody's watching BritBox or whatever, and the internet speeds these things up by making them available to more people. But it doesn't feel like Americans are going to be walking into a bar and saying, "What's the crack?" or something like that. It does. Even if you were to say "snog" instead of "make out," everybody would know you were kind of evoking Harry Potter or doing something British or something like that. It seems like the argument that you're making anyway is these things are delightful aberrations as opposed to something that is an encroaching trend that will eventually take over.
Yeah, I would not say encroaching at all. And a seasoning is a good analogy. They, if food didn't have seasoning, if it was just our own standard Webster's dictionary words, it could be a little boring and dull. And bringing into the language this kind of thing, slang from Wall Street or hip hop or sports. It's part of the way the language gets aerated and made interesting and creative, clever, to use a Britishism, writers can do good things with them. So yeah, it's not a clear and present danger. It's National Lampoon had the cover so and so threat or menace.
Mm-hmm.
It's neither a threat nor menace, but yeah, it's a bit of fun. It's a bit of fun.
It is a lot. We are unfortunately out of time, and we didn't even get to yoiks. I didn't get to do my Daffy Duck impersonation, so you'll have to come back. But the book is, Ben Yagoda's book is Gobsmacked, The British Invasion of American English. We're going to say goodbye. We'll take a break, and we will be back after this.
I wanna make you
And we are back. Our technical producer today is the maestro, Dylan Reyes. The producer of this episode, as you've already heard mentioned, is Jonathan McPants. And we are going to finish up this episode by talking about style books, something that may not even be on your radar at all. Joining us to put it on your radar is Scott Huler, the author of 7 nonfiction books. His most recent is A Delicious Country, Rediscovering the Carolinas Along the Route of John Lawson's 1700 expedition, which sounds really interesting, but it's not what we're here to talk about. What we're here to talk about is or are 9 changes to the Chicago Manual of Style and why they matter. First of all, Scott, welcome to our conversation.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
And I think we have to begin by talking about what a style book or a style guide or a manual of style. It's all the same thing, more or less. But explain what it is for people who've never lived under the iron fist of one of them.
Right. Well, it's the first thing I would do is push back against iron fist. I think a style guide is it's the operations manual. It's the operations manual. If you think of writing prose being like driving a race car, the style book is the style guide is the book that explains to you how the engine works, how the steering connections work, what happens if you lift up weight on the right rear, things like that. A style guide, the first thing that you need to think about if you're not familiar with them is we're not talking about Strunken White style. We're not talking about omit needless words or, try to punch up your sentence. We're not talking Orwell style, find the right word. Those are all valuable things and you should be doing them as a writer. But a style manual is meant less for writers than for copy editors, than for people who are trying to enforce a system of organization onto a piece of writing, if that makes sense. Do we use the serial comma? Do we capitalize the first letter of a complete sentence after a colon? How do we alphabetize if we're using the abbreviation for the word saint? Is that ST or do we assume that's SA? Tiny little things like that. Copy editors, proofreaders are aware of them, and each publication has its own style guide. Most newspapers will use the Associated Press style guide. Most book publishers and magazine publishers will use the Chicago Manual of Style, which started, I think it was first published from the University of Chicago Press in 1906.
Scott, you make it sound all so civilized, and having spent quite a bit of my life in newspaper newsrooms, I mean, the style book also exists for all of the reasons that you just described, but it's probably at its most useful when a reporter and a copy editor are screaming back and forth at each other about what the past tense of plead is. Is it pleaded or is it pled? And there's an answer. I mean, I think the virtue of a style book is at a certain point, you get out the style book and there's an answer, and that's the end of the conversation, or at least it should be. Even if you don't agree with it, in some kind of more universal way.
I could not agree more. I think you've hit it right on the head. That's exactly right. It's for this publication on this date in this place. This is the rule. We can argue about it over beers after the publication hits the press, but this is what we're going to do. Now let's move forward. It answers questions.
Which is not to say that they are not frequently insane. I can't remember which style book it was, but some style book I lived under had kidnapped. The word kidnapped had only one P in it. So it looked like it was kidnapped. In fact, around the newsroom, we started saying kidnapped because that clearly was the way we were going to spell it. I mean, that just strikes me as mind-bogglingly crazy, but it was the style of the paper. And so that's what you go
If I'm not mistaken, that was the correct spelling of kidnapped for years. I think that we've changed recently. I think that was for a long time the correct spelling of kidnapped. But to find that out, we would have to go to the Merriam-Webster and go back historically and figure out when did that change? Did it change? And people who want to know the answers to such things love doing that.
Right. And we should also point out that most newspapers have an official dictionary. It's not always the same one, too. We had Webster's New World, and that's where, if it wasn't in the style book, then you looked it up there. I will also say there's only one instance that I know of a style book being actually funny, and that was the United Press International style book when it was edited by somebody named Bobby Ray Miller. And he had the two words burrow, B-U-R-R-O, and B-U-R-R-O-W. And then he wrote, a burrow is an ass. A burrow is a hole in the ground. As a journalist, you are expected to know the difference.
Wow, that's excellent. I'm very glad to hear that. I never ran across that before. Now, and I will say, the Chicago Manual of Style can be rather self-deprecatingly clever when it's talking about one of the questions that you'll think about if you're laying out a book, and you would refer to a style manual all the time when doing that, is whether you have if you're going to have a pull quote, and it might have a drop cap, right? A great big cap at the beginning of the quote or at the beginning of a chapter or something like that. They call that a drop cap. Well, a lot of times if that's a quote, you're not going to put an open quote in front of that because it looks strange. The quote that the Chicago Manual of Style uses, version after version, edition after edition, the quote that it uses to demonstrate that is, of the making of many books, there is no end, which is from Ecclesiastes. And I love that about Chicago. It's a very clever and self-deprecating way to refer to publishing.
If there's time, I have an obscure question I want to ask you about all this, but I want to get to the stuff that you're writing about. There is a new version of the Chicago Manual of Style, the CMOS, and I think they publish one every 7 years. Fittingly, they publish it.
Or so.
Yeah,
right.
or so. And fittingly, they do publish it as a book in addition to online, which I think is meet and right. And so what's going on lately? I mean, to no one's surprise, the word they, T-H-E-Y, it's been a complicated thing of late. And so Chicago has made some new decisions about it. Say what they are.
Right. Well, in the previous edition, Chicago very hesitantly was willing to accept the word they as a singular pronoun for somebody who didn't want to, acknowledge a particular gender. And they really urged you to write around it. At this point, Chicago has finally said sort of, they is just there, and let's live with it. And which I think is fine. One of the interesting things you find in these discussions is people will drive a stake in the ground based on what their third grade teacher taught them about they as a pronoun. And so that's got to be correct. And when you point out that Shakespeare used it, that doesn't really change their opinion about such a thing. But many of these questions have always been squishy, and it's always been a moving target, and it's okay. But as you correctly noted, what we're doing with the style manual is not saying, this is the law, this is the rule, this is right and that's wrong. It's saying this is how we're going to do it in this situation. And let's just agree with that so we can move forward and stop arguing about it. Other things that have changed is in the last edition, Chicago removed the hyphen from email, and when copy editors learned of that, they applauded at a convention. The copy editors applauded. I love that. Now, esports and ebook have joined that. There are certain, if you think about words much, you may notice that sometimes you'll have an ill-advised thought, and if that hyphenated adjective is before the noun, whereas if you say your thought is ill-advised, it used to be ill and advised were not connected by hyphen. Well, ill-advised is one of a few specific connected adjectives that Chicago now says we're going to keep the hyphen even after the noun. That's a very confusing thing because, for example, if you would say an emerald green tie, that would emerald and green would have a hyphen. If you say the tie is emerald green, it doesn't have a hyphen. Copy editors understand this perfectly. I think most writers do. I think it drives some readers bananas, and you can certainly understand that. Chicago has changed its rules about when you're going to capitalize a word in a headline. Prepositions of 5 or more letters are now capitalized. So
yeah, that's a really interesting one. I'll give an example of this. So years and years and years ago, I published a book called Lose Weight Through Great Sex with Celebrities. And so Chicago would not have although I think in the book, THROUGH is capitalized as its title, as part of its title. But that's not something in the past that Chicago would have done. I think through was specifically mentioned as something that wouldn't be capitalized in a headline.
Right, that sounds right. And now they're saying, yeah, no, that's too big a word. Let's go ahead and capitalize that. And so like the example I used in a recent story, I said words into type. That's a famous other style guide. Into would be lowercase, but much ado about nothing. About would have an uppercase A.
Here's the question that I was going to ask you, and you might not know the answer to this, and it also could be a complete figment of my imagination. But I had this idea that years and years and years ago, the Chicago Style Manual had this odd approach to words like through, like OUGH words, like the GH was off of them or something. Does that resonate at all with you? Is that even possible?
It does not resonate with me, and I would say it sounds unlikely given that Chicago comes from the University of Chicago Press.
True.
It is a University Press style manual and has University Press rectitude in its DNA. So that sounds like something dropping letters from a word like that, especially in headline style, that sounds like something that newspapers would get up to back in the days of print when they were so deeply concerned about space that they decided you could do without the serial comma.
So I know you, like me, think that it is important that this be published in book form, even if an awful lot of copy desks and other users are going to just quickly look things up and search them online. Explain why it's important that it exists, as many style manuals do, in book form.
Well, because holding an object in your hand gives it a kind of reality that simply being online just doesn't. It may be that 20 years from now or 50 years from now, we will no longer feel the distinction, or our children or their children will no longer feel the distinction between a physical object and something that exists only online. I feel the difference, and I know now, I started out when we edited copy with actual blue pencils on actual pieces of paper. So physical reality of editing has great meaning to me, but you would have a little row of reference books on your desk, and every copy editor, there wasn't one for the copy room. I worked in a little room with 5 copy editors. There were 5 copies of Chicago and 5 copies of the Merriam-Webster New Collegiate and, 5 copies of other style manuals, because you just needed that. The second you needed it, you pulled it, you opened it up, you looked at it, you put it back, and you could put Post-it notes in there, and you could underline things, and you could dog your pages. And you turned it into your personal style manual. And especially if you were working somewhere where everybody, I don't care whether you use AP or Chicago or some other style guide, whatever publication you're working on, they're going to have some special changes that we do. I know AP says this, but we do this. And so you'll write that in there, or you'll put a Post-it note in there, and you'll have a note to yourself. And you need that. If you're an editor, you need that. And if you're a writer, especially now that Chicago includes usage and grammar sections, if you're a writer, there are going to be questions of usage and grammar that are just with you for your entire life. You want to be able to easily get to them.
We have to stop there. I do remember, I'm so old, I remember before Post-it notes, I worked in newsrooms where there were pots of glue sitting around. Anyway, Scott Huler, thank you so much, and thank you for talking about the Chicago Manual of Style.